The story of the Hearst estate begins in an era when wealth was expressed not quietly, but in stone, scale, and permanence, and few families embodied that philosophy more completely than the empire built by William Randolph Hearst. By the early 20th century, his influence stretched across newspapers, magazines, and political circles, and with that influence came a desire to construct residences that reflected not only status, but a kind of cultural authority that merged European tradition with American ambition. Beverly Hills, still evolving into a symbol of luxury, became one of the chosen settings for that vision, and the mansion that rose there would eventually stand as one of the most recognizable private estates in the United States. Constructed in the 1920s, the estate was not designed as a simple residence, but as a statement, blending Mediterranean revival architecture with carefully curated details that evoked centuries-old European estates, and every element, from its grand staircases to its manicured gardens, was intended to communicate continuity, stability, and dominance in a rapidly changing modern world. The property's scale alone made it exceptional, but what truly distinguished it was the deliberate layering of history into its design, a technique Hearst favored in many of his projects, most famously at Hearst Castle, where imported ceilings, antique furnishings, and architectural fragments created an environment that felt less constructed and more inherited. Over time, the Beverly Hills mansion transitioned from a private family residence into a cultural landmark, its identity shaped not only by its architecture, but by the figures who passed through its doors, including political leaders, Hollywood elites, and international guests who recognized the estate as a symbol of American wealth at its peak. Among its most notable moments was its association with John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, who spent part of their honeymoon there, a detail that would later become central to the mansion's historical narrative and public fascination. Yet even as the estate accumulated layers of cultural and historical significance, the forces that would one day threaten its existence were already beginning to take shape, driven not by neglect or disaster, but by the evolving economics of land, maintenance, and urban development in Beverly Hills. As decades passed, the cost of preserving such a vast and intricate property grew increasingly difficult to justify, particularly in a city where land values continued to rise and the pressure to maximize real estate potential intensified. By the late 20th century, the mansion had entered a new phase of its life, one defined less by its original purpose and more by the question of what it could become, or whether it could survive at all. Ownership changes brought differing priorities, and while some saw the estate as a legacy worth preserving, others viewed it through a strictly financial lens, where the value of the land often outweighed the historical importance of the structure itself. This tension between preservation and redevelopment would become the central conflict in the mansion's story, shaping every major decision about its future. The physical condition of the estate also played a role in this shift, as buildings of such scale require constant and costly maintenance, and even minor neglect can lead to significant deterioration over time. What had once been a meticulously maintained residence began to show signs of age, and the effort required to restore it to its original standard was no longer trivial. For potential buyers, the mansion represented both an opportunity and a burden, a rare property with unmatched prestige, but also a complex and expensive commitment. At the same time, Beverly Hills itself was changing, evolving into a global symbol of luxury real estate, where modern design and newly constructed megamansions increasingly define the market. In this environment, older estates faced a difficult reality, as buyers often preferred to build new properties tailored to contemporary tastes rather than invest in the restoration of historic homes. The Hearst estate, despite its pedigree, was not immune to this trend, and its future became uncertain as it struggled to align with the expectations of a new generation of ultra-wealthy buyers. These pressures gradually pushed the mansion toward a critical point, where the possibility of demolition was no longer hypothetical but actively considered, raising questions about the value of history in a market driven by profit and efficiency. The estate's connection to figures like John F. Kennedy added weight to the argument for preservation, but even that association was not always enough to guarantee protection, particularly in a regulatory environment where private property rights often take precedence over historical sentiment. As discussions about the mansion's fate intensified, the story began to attract public attention, transforming what might have been a quiet real estate decision into a broader conversation about cultural heritage, architectural preservation, and the responsibilities that come with owning historically significant properties. The Hearst estate was no longer just a private residence. It had become a symbol of a larger conflict between past and present, memory and market value. The question that emerged was not simply whether the mansion would survive, but what its survival would mean, and whether preserving such a property could be justified in purely practical terms. For some, the answer was clear, rooted in the belief that certain structures carry a significance that extends beyond their physical form, representing moments in history that cannot be replicated once lost. For others, the argument was less compelling, shaped by the realities of cost, utility, and the ever-changing landscape of luxury real estate. This tension would define the next chapter of the estate's history, setting the stage for a series of decisions that would bring it closer than ever to demolition, and in doing so, reveal the fragile nature of even the most iconic properties when confronted with the forces of modern development. By the early 2000s, the Hearst estate had entered a period of uncertainty that reflected broader shifts in the luxury real estate market, where historic significance was increasingly overshadowed by the demand for new construction, and properties were often valued more for their land than for the structures that occupied it. This transformation was particularly pronounced in Beverly Hills, where the rapid turnover of estates and the rise of modern megamansions created an environment in which even the most storied homes could be seen as expendable. Ownership changes during this period played a critical role in shaping the mansion's trajectory, as each new owner brought a different perspective on what the property represented and what should be done with it. Some viewed the estate as a piece of living history, an architectural and cultural artifact that deserved careful preservation, while others approached it as a high-value asset whose potential could be unlocked through redevelopment. These competing visions created a cycle of uncertainty, where long-term planning was often overshadowed by short-term considerations. The financial realities of maintaining the mansion became increasingly difficult to ignore, as the cost of upkeep for a property of such scale extended far beyond routine maintenance, encompassing structural repairs, restoration of historical features, and compliance with modern building standards. For many potential buyers, these costs represented a significant deterrent, particularly when compared to the relative simplicity of constructing a new home designed to contemporary specifications. At the same time, the mansion's historical associations, including its connection to John F. Kennedy, continued to generate public interest and media attention, adding a layer of complexity to any decision about its future. The idea that a property with such a legacy could be demolished sparked debate among preservationists, historians, and the general public, who saw the estate as more than just a private residence, but as a cultural landmark with national significance. Despite this attention, the legal framework governing historic preservation in Beverly Hills offered limited protection for privately owned properties, particularly those that had not been formally designated as historic landmarks. Without such designation, the mansion remained vulnerable to demolition, subject to the preferences of its owner and the economic incentives of the market. This lack of formal protection would prove to be a critical factor in the events that followed. As redevelopment plans began to surface, the possibility of demolishing the mansion became increasingly tangible, driven by the potential to replace it with a larger, more modern structure that could better align with current market trends. In many cases, such projects promised substantial financial returns, making them difficult to resist from a purely economic standpoint. The Hearst estate, with its expansive grounds and prime location, represented a particularly attractive opportunity for such transformation. The debate over the mansion's future intensified as these plans became more widely known, drawing in a range of stakeholders with differing priorities and perspectives. Preservation advocates argued that the estate's architectural and historical significance justified its protection, emphasizing the importance of maintaining tangible connections to the past in a rapidly changing urban environment. Developers and investors, on the other hand, focused on the practical considerations of cost, utility, and market demand, viewing the property through the lens of opportunity rather than heritage. This conflict highlighted a broader issue within the field of historic preservation, where the value of a property is often difficult to quantify, particularly when it is measured against the financial incentives of redevelopment. Unlike public landmarks, which are typically protected by law, private estates like the Hearst Mansion exist in a more ambiguous space, where their survival often depends on the willingness of individual owners to prioritize preservation over profit. As the situation continued to evolve, the mansion became a focal point for discussions about the responsibilities of ownership and the role of cultural heritage in contemporary society. The question of whether a property's historical significance should impose limitations on its use or redevelopment remained unresolved, reflecting a tension that extends far beyond a single estate. For the Hearst estate, this tension would ultimately bring it to the brink of demolition, as economic pressures, changing tastes, and the absence of strong legal protections combined to create a scenario in which its survival was far from guaranteed. The decisions made during this period would determine not only the fate of the mansion, but also the broader narrative of how historic properties are valued and treated in an increasingly market-driven world. The turning point in the story of the Hearst estate came when the abstract possibility of demolition began to take on concrete form, as proposals moved beyond speculation and into actionable plans that could permanently alter the property. By this stage, the mansion's future was no longer a matter of distant concern, but an immediate and pressing issue that demanded resolution. Developers and investors evaluating the estate approached it with a clear set of priorities, focusing on the potential to maximize the value of the land through redevelopment. In this context, the existing structure was often seen not as an asset, but as a constraint, limiting the scope of what could be built and adding complexity to any construction project. The idea of starting from scratch, free from the limitations of an aging and historically significant building, held considerable appeal. At the same time, the cost of restoring the mansion to its former condition continued to rise, driven by the need to address structural issues, update outdated systems, and preserve intricate architectural details that required specialized expertise. These factors contributed to a growing perception that preservation was not only expensive, but also impractical, particularly in a market where buyers increasingly favored modern amenities and design. Public awareness of the situation grew as media coverage highlighted the mansion's precarious position, bringing attention to its connection with figures like William Randolph Hearst and John F. Kennedy. This coverage helped to frame the estate as more than just a piece of real estate, emphasizing its role as a cultural and historical landmark whose loss would represent a broader erosion of architectural heritage. Preservationists responded by advocating for measures that could protect the mansion from demolition, including efforts to secure historic designation and raise public support for its conservation. These efforts were driven by the belief that once such a property is lost, it cannot be replaced, and that its value extends beyond its physical structure to encompass the stories and history it represents. Despite these efforts, the outcome remained uncertain, as the decision ultimately rested with the property's owner and the regulatory framework governing development in Beverly Hills. The balance between private property rights and public interest proved difficult to navigate, particularly in a context where financial considerations carried significant weight. The situation underscored the challenges inherent in preserving historic properties in a modern urban environment, where economic pressures, changing tastes, and legal limitations often converge to create conditions that are unfavorable to conservation. For the Hearst estate, these challenges brought it closer than ever to demolition, raising the possibility that its legacy could be reduced to memory. Yet even as the threat of demolition loomed, the mansion's story continued to evolve, shaped by the actions and decisions of those involved in its fate. Whether it would ultimately be preserved or lost remained an open question, one that reflected broader themes about the value of history and the forces that shaped the built environment. In the final phase of its near demolition, the fate of the Hearst estate hinged on a convergence of financial calculation, public perception, and the intangible weight of historical legacy, each exerting pressure in different directions as the decision approached its conclusion. What made the situation particularly complex was that none of these forces operated in isolation, and each had the capacity to influence the outcome in ways that were not always predictable. By this stage, the economic argument for redevelopment had been clearly established, rooted in the substantial value of the land and the potential returns associated with constructing a new, modern estate tailored to contemporary preferences. In a market like Beverly Hills, where demand for luxury properties remained strong, the incentive to replace an aging mansion with a newly built residence was both rational and compelling from an investment perspective. At the same time, the cultural and historical significance of the property continued to resonate, reinforced by its association with figures such as John F. Kennedy and its connection to the broader legacy of William Randolph Hearst. These associations provided a counterweight to the economic rationale for demolition, highlighting the extent to which the mansion functioned as a repository of history rather than merely a physical structure. The resolution of this tension ultimately depended on the willingness of those involved to recognize and act upon the value of preservation, even in the absence of strong legal requirements to do so. In this sense, the mansion's survival was not guaranteed by policy or regulation, but by a combination of advocacy, awareness, and individual decision-making that collectively shaped its outcome. The broader implications of the case extended beyond the property itself, offering insight into the dynamics that influence the preservation of historic estates in modern cities. The near demolition of the Hearst mansion illustrated how easily such properties can be placed at risk, particularly when their value is assessed primarily in financial terms, and how difficult it can be to balance the competing demands of heritage and development. In the end, the story of the mansion is defined not only by the threat it faced, but by what that threat revealed about the priorities and values of the society in which it exists. It serves as a reminder that history, while often celebrated in principle, can be surprisingly vulnerable in practice, especially when it stands in the path of economic opportunity. The Hearst estate remains a powerful example of this reality, its near demolition reflecting a moment when the past and the present came into direct conflict, and when the outcome depended on the choices made by a relatively small number of individuals. Whether viewed as a cautionary tale or a case study in preservation, its story continues to resonate, offering lessons about the importance of recognizing and protecting the cultural landmarks that connect us to our collective history.